Okay, so in front of me I have the two main new iPads for 2021, the M1 iPad Pro and the new iPad mini 6. And here I have the 2020 model of the iPad Pro. Actually, I'm just messing with you. This is the 2018 and this 2021 is actually the 2020. Yeah, they all look identical. Which begs the question, what is the future of the iPad going to look like? As for the past 3 years, the iPad Pro has looked exactly the same. And even the lower end iPads, the iPad Air, and the Mini have also received this exact design. So 5 years from now, will all iPads look the same, just in different sizes? Well, I'm gonna go through each iPad model and see where they are now and where they'll be in a few years' time. Okay, now if you have any iPad, then you should definitely try out Paperlike, our sponsor for this video. I've used it for the majority of last year on my iPad Pro when I was preparing for my British citizenship exam, and it was so nice to have. It makes writing and drawing on the iPad Pro so much better as it gives you the friction that you're normally used to from actual paper. So if you're a student and you do a lot of note-taking on your iPad, or you are an artist who draws or sketches, then Paperlike is going to make your life so much easier. Check it out by using the link below. Starting off with the 9th gen iPad, this starts at just $329, which is $70 less than the baseline Apple Watch Series 7. This is currently Apple's entry-level iPad offering. It comes with the Apple A13 chip, same chip as the iPhone 11, a below-than-average rear camera, but a pretty competitive front camera with center stage. Plus, it supports the Apple Pencil and Apple's Smart Keyboard. So for its $329 price point, the base iPad is pretty outstanding. But the catch is that number one, the design is very outdated as this is the only iPad without the new flat frame style design, and number two, the display isn't great. It's not laminated and it doesn't support the P3 color gamut. Now, we have seen a couple of leaks saying that the 2021 model would finally laminate the display, but that just hasn't happened. We haven't had any new leaks on this since, but it is pretty safe to assume that the next visual updates of this iPad would finally bring it in line with the rest of the lineup, which means a flat frame look, no headphone jack, USB Type-C instead of Lightning, and finally, a laminated display. In the best case scenario, this will happen in 2022, as the 9th generation iPad is already the 3rd generation to keep its design unchanged. But I wouldn't be surprised if Apple decides to keep this outdated design for a few more years. Okay, the next category of iPads is the mid-range category, where we have the iPad mini and the iPad Air. The iPad mini starts from $500, so almost $200 more than the baseline iPad. And for that, you're getting a smaller but better display, alongside Apple's modern design language, so USB Type-C in and headphone jack out. You're also getting a faster chip, the A15 versus the A13, which, to be honest, no one's really going to notice as even the A13 is already crazy fast. On top of that, you're getting a much better camera on the back with 4K 60 video as opposed to 1080p 30, and you're also getting the 2nd gen Apple Pencil versus the 1st gen, but you are dropping support for Apple's Smart Keyboard. So you can already tell that for $200 more, the iPad mini doesn't really offer that much extra. But luckily, we do actually have some leaks here coming from Tron, who's mostly a Samsung leaker, and he claims that Samsung Display has shipped an 8.3-inch 120Hz display sample to Apple. This just happens to match the display size of this iPad mini. So it's looking like the 2022 iPad mini could get promotion just like the iPad Pros have, which would make it more worth it, but Tron also said that the price would actually go up, so maybe not that much worth it in the end. Here's the thing, the display on this current iPad mini is bad. Not only does it have the infamous jelly scroll issue, but it's also quite dim. This right here is the 2015 iPad mini 4, and as you can probably tell, it is considerably brighter than the new 2021 model is. Oh, and as a bonus, it doesn't have the infamous jelly scroll issue that the new model does, and if you take a look at the home screen icons, they're actually larger on the older model. So with iPadOS 15, Apple made everything, I don't know, just the padding and the grid layout is completely off, so you get a lot of space that's not utilized. So a 2022 iPad mini with a 120Hz refresh rate would at least make that jelly scroll issue go away. And on top of this, Tron mentioned that this new iPad mini would also come with 128 gigabytes of storage. On the current iPad mini, you can only pick between 64 and 256. He also stated that the Apple A15 chip would run at the same 3.23 GHz frequency as it does on the iPhone 13s, rather than the lower 2.9 GHz that it currently runs at on this iPad mini. However, I just don't believe this to be the case. The current iPad mini is already overpriced, and I just don't see Apple releasing a Pro model that would be even more expensive and only have that ProMotion display, as the main extra feature. What I think will happen is Apple adding a third size to the iPad Pro lineup, this new 8.7-inch alongside 11-inch and the 12.9-inch. I also see Apple dropping the iPad mini name entirely, as the lineup is way too confusing now. Of course, that the only issue would be the lack of an M1 chip inside this new iPad mini, but I think that even then, it would still make way more sense than having the 4 iPad categories that we have now. Speaking of categories, the next iPad on the list is the iPad Air, and this is an odd one. You see, right now, the iPad Air serves as a more affordable iPad Pro, starting at $600, $100 more than the iPad mini, yet $200 less than the 11-inch iPad Pro. Over the mini, you're getting a much larger 10.9-inch display and support for Apple's Magic Keyboard, but you're actually getting a worse processor, the A14 versus the A15. You only get 4G instead of 5G, and you also don't get the upgraded front-facing camera with center stage that the iPad mini has. Some earlier reports were stating that Apple was considering upgrading the Air to an OLED display in 2022, but according to a more recent report from the ELEC, that would no longer be the case, as apparently Apple has walked out of a collaboration with Samsung that involved OLED displays for iPads, since Apple was not satisfied with the brightness levels and the longevity of the OLED panels. And display supply chain consultants, Ross Young's company, they reported that the first OLED iPad won't be coming until 2023. And if we are to go by Ross Young's 100% track record so far, we can already say goodbye to an OLED iPad Air in 2022, which means that a 2022 iPad Air would get an updated processor, likely the A16, which would finally make it superior to the iPad mini performance-wise. It would add 5G and update the front camera through center stage, and that's basically it. Mark Gurman does say that Apple plans on adding Face ID to all iPad models, but that might not happen for at least a couple more years. Assuming that Apple doesn't increase the price, the 2022 iPad Air would definitely be way more worth it than it is now. But this does make me wonder, if the entry-level iPad would become the iPad Air, what would eventually become of the iPad Air? Like, I honestly don't see a reason for this to exist. Apple's lineup would make much more sense if they only had 2 models, the iPad and the iPad Pro, with the iPad Pro featuring 3 display sizes, 8.3-inch, 11-inch, and 12.9-inch. Would love to hear your thoughts on all of this down below. And then the last iPad model is the iPad Pro. This is currently part of Apple's high-end tablet offering. Over the iPad Air, the iPad Pro offers a slightly larger 11-inch display, as well as a much larger 12.9-inch option. A better camera, LiDAR, more RAM, a more powerful M1 processor, more storage, Thunderbolt, and ProMotion, for $300 more. So what about a 2022 iPad Pro? Because I feel like this iPad Pro has already reached the pinnacle of its evolution. It has insane performance, literally desktop class, it's crazy thin, it's got an outstanding display, and all the lower-end iPads are getting updated with more and more features to resemble this iPad Pro until we'll get to a point where they would all be an iPad Pro. But the iPad Pro still has to be superior, so what extra features could it get? Well, Ming Chi Kuo believes that in 2022, the 11-inch model would be getting mini LED as well. Apple has had supply constraints in 2021, reason why only the 12.9-inch model switched to mini LED. We also know that the 2022 iPad Pros would be getting Apple's M2 chip, which is expected to be more power efficient than the M1, as it would be manufactured on a smaller 4nm processor than 5nm. On top of this, it is expected to have a 10-core GPU up from the 8-core that we have now, and the CPU core count would remain the same at 8. All this sounds great, but an even more powerful processor is probably the last thing an iPad Pro needs. But hold on, I might have something good for you. According to Dylan DKT, who's had a pretty good track record so far, the 2022 iPad Pros would feature an horizontal front camera placement, as well as an horizontally placed Apple logo on the back. And apparently the reason for this is that Apple wants to change the way you use your iPad. Most people use it in this portrait mode, which has been the default for quite some time now, but now Apple wants to change it to landscape, which does actually make a lot more sense if you think about it, especially when you have such a keyboard connected. But at the same time, doesn't this literally make it a MacBook? Like, the only major difference between an iPad and a MacBook in this case would be the operating system, the touchscreen, and Apple Pencil support on the iPad. And just to make things even more fun, according to Mark Gurman, Apple's even testing iPad Pros with displays larger than 12.9 inches, which is weird. Imagine a 16-inch iPad Pro would you actually pick that over a 16-inch MacBook Pro? Like, it wouldn't make any sense. The MacBook Pro obviously has a much more capable operating system and also way more performance. Anyway, these larger models won't happen in 2022, as according to Mark Gurman, Apple would be busy focusing on a big new iPad Pro redesign. Yes, the iPad Pro is apparently getting a major redesign next year, one that would feature a full glass back. But hold on a minute, a glass back on an iPad? That sounds like a horrible idea. Not only will it attract plenty of fingerprints, but if you drop this thing, the chance of it shattering is pretty high. Well, not necessarily. I did talk about this glass iPad Pro idea in one of our previous videos, and we even made a concept of it. If Apple uses the same ceramic shield frosted glass back that they're currently using on the iPhone, not only will it be smudge-proof, but it could also be fairly resistant to shattering. So I do think that an iPad Pro like this would look quite awesome. My only worry though is the weight, as a glassback iPad would be heavier than the current aluminium models. But on the bright side, we would apparently get wireless charging and reverse wireless charging, so you will just be able to place your AirPods on top or even your iPhone, and the iPad would actually charge these devices, at least that's the idea. And then after 2022, the Alec reports that Apple is currently in talks with Samsung and LG for a dual-stacked OLED panel. This has never been done before, but in theory, it would allow the OLED display to actually be brighter than what OLEDs typically are. This was the main reason why Apple decided to go with Mini LED this year, to allow for that greater brightness, even though we do have those backlight bleeding issues, which will be solved with this dual-stacked OLED panel. The Alex report also claims that this new display would be an LTPO OLED panel, with a refresh rate between 10Hz and 120Hz, just like on the iPhone 13 Pros. The current iPad Pro would only go as low as 24Hz. This dual-stacked OLED display is set to come in 2023 or even the 2024 models, so unfortunately, these are not for next year. On top of this, Apple is also said to be researching and developing their own micro-LED technology. We all know that that's the future, as it has all the benefits of OLED, just much brighter and without the risk of burn-in. However, micro-LED won't be ready for at least a few more years. Okay, so from the looks of it, all iPads would eventually become an iPad Pro. And then the iPad Pro will just get updated with things such as a faster processor and eventually that dual-stacked OLED display, which would also be updated by micro LED at some point. All of this sounds, to be honest, a bit boring. And it's not really Apple's fault. The iPad has already reached its final form. And unless Apple decides to go for a foldable iPad, there's not much else that it can do hardware-wise. I would personally love to see a big improvement in terms of the battery life, as all the iPads, fun fact, have had the exact same 10-hour battery life. I would love to see like 20 or even more, like we have on the new MacBook Pros. I would also love to see Apple go hard on supporting AAA games and turning this thin slab of glass into the next-gen Nintendo Switch. They could easily do that if they just gave development studios financial incentives to port their games. But right now, it's looking like the iPad Pro will only get very minor improvements year on year, with the rest of the iPad line slowly getting iPad Pro-like features that would eventually turn them into an iPad Pro. But let me know in the comments, what do you guys think? Where do you think the iPad is heading towards? And definitely subscribe if you want to see more leaks rumors videos on the next-gen iPads. I'm Daniel, this has been Zen of Tech, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Zen of Tech, signing out. Cheers.